Go ahead, or do you want to say something?
Welcome to PAC meeting number 6 of the UGB expansion study project. I'm Andy Martin, city manager. Folks around the table are part of our PAC group. Introductions all the way around?
Yeah.
Okay. Charlie, why don't we start with you and we'll work our way.
Great. Charlie Hopewell, board chair, Camera Companies.
Commissioner. Doug Camp, planning commissioner and parks board chair.
Stuart King, chairman of the planning commission.
Terry Lenahan, Mayor of North Plains.
Yeah, said that already? Yep.
Heather Austin with 3J Consulting. I'm assisting with the land use planning.
Steve Faust with 3J Consulting, also assisting with the land use planning.
Nick Wilson and Associates, I'm assisting with the transportation planning.
And then we have a few of our PAC committee members joining us virtually. Let's start with Glenn.
Yeah, this is Glenn Bolin. I am principal planner with Region 1 ODOT.
Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Kelly, Regional Representative for Department of Land Conservation and Development.
Okay, I have no volume.
Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Young, Senior Urban Planner with DLCD.
Eric.
I'm Eric Lawson. I'm representing the Economic Development Committee for North Plains.
And I think that's all that we have right now. We know Jessica Pels from Washington County is going to be joining just a little bit late. And I don't know if from Washington County Housing Authority will be joining tonight. All right, Andy, if we could pull up the PowerPoint, that would be great. So welcome again, everyone, to our 6th meeting. We're continuing to move through this process, but we've got a little ways to go. What? Next slide, please, Andy.
Sorry, multitasking by muting people and going through this.
So tonight, what we're going to do is have a brief update on the EOA process from Bill. Then I will talk a bit about the UGB expansion process. We will review the draft boundary location analysis reports that we put together. Then Heather is going to take us through an exercise looking at growth scenarios over the next 40 years. And we'll explain that when we get to that point in the agenda. Then we'll take some time for public comment and wrap up with next steps. Next slide. So Bill.
Okay. EOA update. Okay, so the economic opportunities analysis, which is the state land use planning goal 9 document that's in our comprehensive plan that identifies land need over the 20-year period we're planning for employment uses. That report we talked about at length at the last meeting. Since then, City Council adopted the EOA in May, just in May. Since then, we've also gotten comment from DLCD, the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. They're the state regulatory agency that works with us on this process, including the EOA itself. And they've asked for some additions, a couple primary additions to be added to the EOA just to kind of strengthen or buttress some of the arguments we're making for the land need over the 20-year period, just to add to its defense, basically. And then, so we got that information from them in June. We turned around and very recently here in July provided draft amendments to the EOA for them to take a look at. And we'll surely be meeting again with them soon to kind of talk about that. But that next meeting hasn't been quite set yet. We're expecting, and we actually just confirmed today, that DLCD's deputy director and Laura Kelly, I believe, who is joining us this evening, is going to come and speak to City Council in September and just talk about the EOA and We've gotten very great supportive expression from Kirsten Green, the deputy director, on our planning efforts here. And so she wants to come and speak in person and also answer questions. And so we're expecting that to happen in September. Let's see, Planning Commission. After all these edits are done, we're going to go back to Planning Commission and have Planning Commission here, the amendments to the EOA. And in October, we should be ready to put that before City Council to consider adoption of the amendments to the EOA that came out of work with DLC. So that's our schedule, and that's what's been happening since. We can go ahead and move forward, I guess. Andy, thank you. Okay, so this is actually a rather big and remarkable development, I will say. While we were doing the EOA, in the middle of it, Governor Brown pulled together a special task force on semiconductor competitiveness in the state, really in response to Intel deciding to invest massively in Ohio. And the task force was pulled together to identify what can be done better in Oregon in order to keep those types of employers expanding in Oregon. So what's happened over the last few months is that committee, that task force, has identified the need for hundreds of acres of industrial land, development-ready industrial land, in appropriate places to allow semiconductor and supply chain companies to invest and expand in a predictable in a predictable way in the near and medium term future. Residential growth that do work in Hillsborough at some of these companies. We're now being included in discussion about how Oregon's semiconductor industry can be competitive in the future. And so our expansion and some of the employment land that we're looking at adding is now part of that conversation. So that's the great thing about that, honestly, is that last week or the week before, the CHIPS Act, the federal CHIPS Act, was signed by President Biden, and that releases about $52 billion to the states and other interests to invest in the ability for these industries to grow. And Oregon, because of all the work that it's put into with this task force, stands a chance to get certainly at least its fair share of those federal funds. So we may very well be looking at opportunity to get assistance of certain types with certain industries that might find North Plains an attractive place to invest. And that will potentially be facilitated by the CHIPS Act. So that task force is still in working through and coming up with final recommendations that the state of Oregon would then take and move forward with. We don't know how much money Oregon will get of the CHIPS Act. So there's a lot of questions about all of that. But it just underscores the importance of the timing and of what North Plains is doing with its UGB and why it's doing it with its UGB. So that's sort of not completely out of nowhere, but it's been a kind of a big development in terms of how our process is going.
A quick question is, could you speculate at this point of whether this kind of interest would either accelerate or decelerate the current UGB process?
So I think the answer to that is, what I know is that different departments of the state of Oregon are working actually very closely together, including DLCD, Business Oregon, and a few other departments are working in support of this. And I think what that means is that for some of the specific things that the task force is going to identify needs to be done, and what needs to be provided for industries to grow here. I think the main thing is the departments are working together very closely. And so I do see any time that would be spent coordinating between departments that may or not be coordinating really closely, that any time frame that would be we'd be dealing with is shorter. Yeah, that's how I would put it.
Yeah. Okay. Great, thanks.
Other questions for Bill about the EOA process? I can't see the folks obviously online, Andy. I assume you're monitoring that.
Yes.
Okay, if there are no questions or comments, then let's keep moving.
Glenn said it was clear. Stand over proof.
Good, good. Okay, just a reminder, from 2020 to, from September 2020 to June 2021, we looked at refining our land need, which because of the status of the EOA is technically still ongoing. But we accomplished most of what we wanted to there. We refined the land supply, which was looking at our buildable lands inventory and looking at efficiency measures within the urban growth boundary. And we established our study area. Starting in September 2021, we began conducting this boundary location analysis, which we will go through the results of in just a moment here. We've added a subtask here. So I'll introduce this now so there's no mystery here. You know, ultimately what we want to do is decide where North Plains wants to grow, but also what the land uses will be. And as you know, we'll look at this again in a moment. Right now, assuming the EOA is approved, we're looking at close to 1,000 acres, 900 some acres for the urban growth boundary expansion. I believe the entire study area, the entire area that North Plains has to possibly grow is about 1,500 acres. So we thought rather than at one meeting trying to decide where we're going to grow and what the land uses would be, we're going to take a look today in the second part of our meeting at the full study area and look at what we think the land uses should be. And then at our next meeting, we'll set that urban growth boundary. We'll already have the land uses in place. And then at the next meeting, we'll decide, okay, how many acres do we want to grow in each direction, if that makes sense. And I think it'll be a little more clear when we get to that agenda item. So at our next meeting, we'll work with you to, as I said, to make a recommendation of where the city wants to grow. And then eventually we'll move into the adoption process. And once the city adopts it, then we need to work with the county and the state for their approval. Next slide, please. So again, as a reminder here, we have our residential land need, about 110 acres for the housing itself. We applied a factor of 15% for right-of-way for infrastructure. That's another 16 acres. As Heather has detailed in our phase 1 report and past presentations, another 40 acres for parks. And then we coordinated with the Hillsborough School District, who said at this time they do not foresee needing any acreage for new schools in this urban growth boundary expansion. On the employment side, so the residential need is a total of 167 acres. On the employment side, we have a commercial demand of 142 acres. We have an industrial need of 545 acres. And then again, we applied that right-of-way of 15% for a total of 791 acres. Important to note that industrial need of 545 acres is a really important driver in the EOA and in the need for residential and the need for commercial. That's an important driver and everything else, all the other land demands that we're seeing. So for employment, we have a total of 791 acres, and the total needed acreage overall, I believe it was a little short of 960 acres. So that's what we're looking at. Next slide, please. So Laura from DLCD, who's part of our PAC, provided us with some documents to helpful. They're not mandatory, but guidance documents to make sure that we're kind of checking the boxes as we move through this process. And this was some new information for us. So I wanted to just share this with you as well to show how we're moving along in checking the steps that we need to do along the way. So we've already analyzed our population and job growth forecast and looked at target industries development potential. We've identified our housing land need. We have identified our employment land need, although that's not completely finalized. And then identified other land needs as I just went through. We created a preliminary study area. We evaluated that study area and have proposed making certain exclusions and created a final study area. Next slide. 3 is analyzing the study area. That includes parcel prioritization. I'll go over that in a minute, just a reminder of the order in which we need to look at bringing lands into the urban growth boundary. We looked at suitability criteria relative to employment land needs. And today we're going to go through the draft goal 14 location, boundary location analysis. Task 4 is looking at urbanization potential, evaluating our comprehensive plan policies, which the city has done, although after urban growth boundary expansion, there will probably need to be some additions. For instance, the transportation system plan doesn't currently consider the expansion lands. So some of these documents in the comprehensive plan will need to be updated to address the lands that are brought into the urban growth boundary. We've looked at statewide planning goal applicability to our parcels, things like goal 5 resources and things of that nature. As I mentioned, Heather helped us look at efficiency measures within the existing urban growth boundary. And tonight, as part of our goal 14 analysis, is really this developing patient and serviceability analysis, looking at the ability of the city to serve the lands we brought in. So we did all that. The one thing box we haven't checked is finalizing our expansion recommendation, which again, we hope to do by the end of this year. Next slide, please. And then the 5th and final task and subtasks all have to do with adoption and approval from the city, the county, and the state. Any questions about the process we've been through or where we're headed? Okay, let's keep going, Andy. So we'll get into the boundary location analysis here. So a reminder, at our last meeting, we had a conversation about, you'll recall that we had more sub areas. There was 3 south sub areas, excuse me, 2 west sub areas, 1 north sub area, and 5 east sub areas. And through conversations with city staff, we decided to consolidate those somewhat to simplify the analysis. So now what we have is west, north, east, and then south A and south B. And that's, so we updated our analysis to apply to those sub areas. Next slide. Again, just a reminder of this prioritization. And for this analysis at this point, you'll probably recall we've talked a lot about excluding the area around the airport from this analysis, but we've also received guidance from Pat Ravella, who's part of our team, that we should, in case that is not successful, we should still develop our analysis as if we need to consider those lands. So first, we're going to need to consider those exception lands to the south. The second and third priorities are marginal lands and then low value farm and forest land. We showed in our phase 1 report that North Plains has no marginal lands and that North Plains has no low value farm and forest land. It's all high value farm and forest land. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Andy. Essentially, if you look at that south area, the dotted area, the blue dotted area, that's the exception land that state law says we need to consider first. Excuse me. Everything else, those other parcels to the south, west, north, and east, the rest of those are treated equally. So first we consider the exception land, and then secondarily we'll be considering the rest of the whole rest of the study area. Next slide. Was there any questions, sorry, about the prioritization at all? Okay, I know we've been through it a few times, but for the goal 14 location factors, the analysis we did, just a quick reminder, number 1 is efficient accommodation of identified land needs. The second is orderly and economic provision of public facilities and services, both transportation and water, sewer, stormwater. Third is a comparative analysis of environmental, energy, economic, and social consequences. And the fourth is compatibility with nearby agricultural and forest activities. Excuse me. We can go to the next slide. I will mention that by the nature of going from smaller sub areas to larger ones, that was a little bit of a challenge. We went from a little bit finer grained analysis to a little bit bigger picture. And you might notice that as we go along, but we'll go ahead and walk through. So in terms of location factors, we looked or the first location factor, we looked at 4 criteria, so to speak. Proximity to the existing urban growth boundary, the suitability of the land, and that applies to employment land, suitability to meet our employment land needs. Parcel size, which also I was reminded today applies to employment land, but according to state law does not apply to residential land. So it's not something we would consider as we move forward for residential land. And then the total buildable land that's available in these different sub areas. Next slide. So a couple simple maps. This one follows logic pretty well. The green is, so this is proximity. The green is the land that is within a 1/4 mile of the urban growth boundary, yellow a 1/2 mile, orange 3/4 mile, and red 1 1/4 miles, I guess. Just an illustration of, according to that factor, which lands we should be considering first. Next. Parcelization. The darkest parcels are the largest ones. Parcelization, the larger the parcels, the easier it is to accommodate the cities, the easier it is to develop. So that's why parcelization was one of these factors. Other than the south sub area, North Plains has a lot of very large parcels surrounding the current UGB. So I don't know that that is a huge differentiator, but it would certainly be for employment lands when we're looking at that south sub area or those south sub areas. Next. The second part of the second location factor, orderly and economic provision of public facilities, we looked at transportation. Nick's here to answer questions if you have any, but we looked at regional and local mobility, including goods and services freight mobility for commercial and industrial, safe access, environmental factors, feasibility, and looking at a balanced system. Next slide. The other part of that is our sanitary sewer, stormwater, and water. And what we really looked at there was existing or planned infrastructure to support development. So where is their current infrastructure? Where does it end? Where would it be easy to hook up to serve areas that are would be brought into the urban growth boundary? Next slide. So the ESEE analysis, again, environmental, energy, economic, and social consequences and I will say there, for all these factors, there isn't a lot of guidance from the state on how to analyze these factors. So we looked at other efforts to expand urban growth boundaries and our own knowledge and expertise of these topic matters and really developed these criteria ourselves for the most part. Economic, we looked at the cost of land and infrastructure, parcel size, development potential, and diversifying the tax base. Social, ease of access to schools, parks, other amenities, community health indicators, compatible nearby uses, the cost of construction, and looking to, as was identified as a goal by City Council through the EOA process, looking to reverse the bedroom community trend. Next. For environmental, we looked at Goal 5 resources. Those are natural resources that might be present and need to be protected, and then hazard risks such as steep slopes or floodplains. And then energy, we looked at ability to reduce vehicle miles traveled, looking at the feasibility for alternative modes of transportation, so connectivity in terms of walking, biking, and potentially transit. And then the presence of heating and cooling structures, such as are there large trees present. Next slide. The fourth factor, compatibility with nearby agricultural and forest activities. High potential conflict are those adjacent uses that have intensive livestock or poultry processing operations, feedlots or dairies. Moderate potential conflict are commodity crops, row crops, orchards, vineyards, hay and grass seed. And then low potential conflict are woodlots, pasture, grazing, and passive management uses. So we're really looking at those agricultural impacts on the agricultural industry. Next slide. So we'll just, some summary notes. Hopefully everyone got a chance to look at the analysis, but some summary notes for each of the sub areas. For the north, excuse me, this is obviously adjacent to the urban growth boundary and includes large unconstrained parcels. Mainline extensions for water, sanitary, and sewer are present, so those would not be needed to develop that area. Excuse me. There's a potential for strong, safe, and convenient multimodal access. Regional mobility is within a mile via Highway 26 and Northwest Glencoe Road. And there's a low potential conflict with adjacent agricultural uses. Next slide, please. For South Sub Area A, it is adjacent to the city's urban growth boundary, but Highway 26 is a barrier. There are smaller parcel sizes surrounding that Sunset Airstrip. Mainline extensions for sanitary, storm, and water would be needed to service this area. There are some, there's definitely regional mobility potential due to the airstrip. Interesting. We might have mischaracterized this a bit. I think there's some regional mobility due to Highway 26 and the Glencoe Road interchange. Highway 26 limits ped bike connectivity, and there are some challenges due to the airstrip and private roads for kind of connectivity. Is that right? Yeah. Development is unlikely due to take place due to existing ownership patterns, private streets, the airstrip, and associated airplane maneuvering facilities. And then agricultural compatibility, there's a moderate potential conflict with adjacent uses. Next slide, please. South Sub Area B, adjacent to the urban growth boundary, again with separated by Highway 26, also has somewhat smaller parcel sizes than the rest of the sub areas. It would need mainline extensions for sanitary and stormwater for the area. There's strong regional mobility potential due to the proximity to the Highway 26 Glencoe Road interchange. But again, Highway 26 somewhat limits kind of multimodal connectivity from downtown to that area. And then again, agricultural compatibility, there's moderate potential conflict based on those agricultural uses we mentioned earlier. Next slide. The west sub area, again, adjacent to the UGB with large unconstrained parcels. Mainline extensions do exist to that adjacent area for sanitary and storm. In some of the areas, I think more for the southern portion of that sub area than the northern portion. Water infrastructure updates are needed for that area. There is strong regional mobility via Dersham Road interchange and potential for local connectivity via the North Avenue extension, Mountaindale Road, Northwest Pumpkin Ridge Road, and Gordon Road. And again, moderate potential conflict with adjacent agricultural uses.
Clarification, real
Yes.
quick, when you say mainline extensions exist for sanitary storm, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean trunks are located adjacent to all that property?
Yes.
Okay, all right, I just wanted to understand.
No, there's not infrastructure already going through those areas, but it abuts it.
Okay.
Next slide, please. The east sub area, a very large sub area and diverse. It is adjacent to the UGB with many large parcels. There are some significant environmental constraints on the western half of the sub area, And as everyone knows, the Recology site is also located adjacent to this urban growth boundary and city limits in the southwestern corner there. There is access to efficiently tie into infrastructure. There's regional mobility via Highway 26 and Jackson School Road. Local connectivity is dependent upon West Union Road until any development happens. And we know there's long been talk of a road connecting to the city across the McCade Creek corridor. This area has low potential conflict with adjacent agricultural uses. Next slide. So we want to take some time to see if you have any questions about the analysis, if there's any comments or thoughts or observations based on what our analysis came up with. Our next steps in this analysis, take your input. We'll be taking public input later in the meeting and make final refinements to this analysis.
I had a question about the agricultural piece of it. I think there was a map in there that showed the agricultural land.
A very crude map.
Very, very crude, right? I had to really squint at it to look at it, but I was just curious. To me, it seems like it's a lot of grass or hay, with that sort of thing. I'm just kind of curious, are there any other types of crops grown on that particular land that would be, affected in some way, shape, or form if we were to bring it in? And then I'd also like to know, where do those crops go? Like, are they local or are they, across state lines or what?
Can help with the first question. The second question, I don't know, and I don't know, Bill or Andy, if you have spoken with some of those landowners about their operations, but I think this part of the assessment is an area that we want to take a little bit closer look at, because as I mentioned, as we went from smaller sub areas to larger, we may have, lost some of the nuance a little bit. I took a look at it again today, and it seems to me that all of the sub areas are fairly similar in terms of what the adjacent uses are. And we don't have that map up right now, but the one agricultural use that is really noticeable on that map lies to the west of the north sub area and kind of north of West Union Road on the other north of the development that is north of West Union Road, and that's blueberry production. That's the one use that really stands out. The rest seems to be pasture and grass seed and things of that nature. So I'm thinking that if we were to look, when we look at this one more time, we might end up in a situation where all the sub areas essentially score the same. But to your question, it's that patch of blueberry production that really stands out. The rest seems to be clover and wildflower and grass, that nature. But I don't know where those blueberries go.
If I can, just because of the nature of one of our businesses, virtually all of the seed crops that you see around the area are actually either international or out of area. So in other words, the seed is cleaned by either the grower or businesses such as ours, and then it's exported. So, and from what I've seen, certainly from driving around each of the areas, the predominant use of the land is generally in some form of a seed crop, and that could include wheat, by the way.
Okay.
And I did notice that there is wheat to the north as well,
Right.
Especially. So, yeah, like I said, based on those classifications that we have, based on, I think there's essentially moderate potential conflicts, because none of the uses are just passive pasture, anything like that. They all have some sort of seed crop, wheat, blueberry, and then there's no intensive livestock types of uses around. So I think all of them really should, when we get to the final, fall into the moderate conflict.
Yeah, I would think from an agricultural infrastructure standpoint, generally berry crops take one of the greatest amount of infrastructure building because of either underground sprinkler systems or the various ways in which they make sure that the vines or the berries are held up, so.
I have one other question, and I may have known this a long time ago, but how many acres does Recology occupy?
We changed that, so we'd have to look back at the last analysis. I don't know if we have access to that.
Just look at Washington County tax maps and. pull
The
up
tax
their-
lot is 66 acres.
There we go.
Stuart.
Do it.
Stuart's got it all right there. Yeah, we have the acreages. The last meeting, we probably showed the acreage for that ecology site, but when we combined those sub areas, that detail was lost, but it sounds like about 66 acres. Any questions or comments? Oh, I see Glenn's got his hand raised.
Yeah, hey, thanks. Appreciate it. Just two quick points. One, on your lot size analysis, looking at the GIS, I can see that there's a fair number of parcels that are owned by the same LLC or husband-wife duo or individual. So it doesn't probably make a big change, but I just thought I'd point that out because if you're looking for opportunities to site industrial facilities or whatnot, it might look like there's parcels on a map, but if it's the same ownership, the negotiation is a heck of a lot easier than if it's multiples. And the other, just want to mention, you mentioned the east-west connector from a connection from Jackson School Road to Glencoe that would be through the east sub area. That's something that I think is a significant community benefit. So that as you're growing already down there near Jackson School Road, you know, you want people to be able to get back and forth from town to the main street and shopping without having to get on 26. If you're not going to take a bike on 26, you don't want your 16-year-old necessarily doing the merges right away when they're new to driving. So having that local connection is going to be a really important community asset. So I'm just thinking that way. It also, yeah, something I think there's a positive element to that. I know you have some expensive probably crossings to deal with because you do have wetlands and a stream there, but that could be a pretty good local connection. So just mention that.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you, Glenn. And I think that connection is important for water service as well, from what I understand. Kevin. You're on mute, Kevin.
Geez, I was launched in my whole thing. Thanks, Steve. And I think you've said this already, but just a reminder, as we're looking at the different sub areas, keep in mind they're not all similarly positioned in relation to the rules. Specifically, you know, the area, the south area includes those exception lands, and those are the first lands to be considered for inclusion in the urban growth boundary expansion area. I think the staff have made a really compelling case for why South Area A is not likely to redevelop in the near term, and there are some real constraints there. South Area B remains as an area that may meet some of your identified land needs. So it may make sense to think about what kinds of land needs would be accommodated in some of the sub areas versus other sub areas. The remaining areas are all similarly situated, is my understanding. So west, north, and east all contain those high value farmlands. And so in that area, choosing between those different areas, you have more discretion under the rules. Hopefully that makes sense.
That does, Kevin. Thanks for that. And again, you'll recall that we have had some conversation about trying to exclude some of that area from the study. No final decision has been made on that, which is why we didn't go through the exercise for this meeting of looking at that land first, then the other second. But I appreciate your reminder that if that is something that the city would need to do if we decide to move forward with excluding some of that south sub area and are unsuccessful in doing so, or if we just decide not to exclude that area, we need to consider the exception land first and then everything else subsequently. Thank you.
Another question, since we've got ODOT on the line as well, is in regard to the Dersham Road access and so forth. Are we aware of any potential compliance constraints and so forth in regard to us considering that land to the west and whether Dersham Road could or could not be included into an interchange.
So, yeah, so Dersham Road already is an interchange, right? It's very separated. I don't know off the top of my head if we have an interchange area management plan for Dersham. I can look that up. But it's an existing access that's very separated. That's the safe kind. So I'm not sure if there's more of a detailed question than that. I mean, there's public access to it.
Yeah, as long as there's no constraints, that would be my only question.
Anything to add?
No,
Yeah.
Glenn, I don't believe there is an IAMPA interchange area management plan for Dersham. Glenn, if you can look that up easily, might be worth it, but I'm pretty sure there is not.
Okay.
And maybe on the same vein, the railroad, are there any constraints or, there that we need to be aware of?
Could not quite hear that. Could you repeat?
Kind of on the same line, there's a railroad on the west side. Are there any particular constraints or any types of issues that we should be aware of?
Railroads are very tricky. Getting new public crossings can be very difficult. In other cases, we've worked, I think you're probably familiar with South Hillsborough with their urban growth boundary expansion. I think I wasn't even at ODOT, but I think that the city and ODOT Rail negotiated, I think they closed 2 unimproved crossings at grade, no gates and all that, in order to get 1 good, substantial improved crossing. So, and I think Nick can probably weigh in on this one too. He's done a lot of work with rail, and I think you told me, Nick, that sometimes it's 2 or 3 accesses you have to close to get 1 good one. So it can be a connectivity problem for sure, getting crossing of the rail, and there's a cost. Obviously, you have to develop because of safety and trains, you have to develop some pretty significant, infrastructure there with the gates and the distances and everything like that to be safe. So it's rail is always difficult. I don't know what the frequency is. I know that the rail through Cornelius, Forest Grove, and to Hillsborough is they're looking at vacating and purchasing and making a trail, the Counts Creek Trail there. So I don't know if that's connected. I think you might still have use on this. I'd have to talk with the rail folks to know more.
Anything to add, Nick?
No, just to echo Glenn's point about sort of the hurdles and challenges with crossing the rail. Any new crossing typically requires 2 to 3 closings of existing crossings. So that's just a cross, and then offset. It's typically a 30-foot from center of rail offset parallel to the rail that you cannot encroach within that if you want to build a road or a trail or anything like that.
So Nick, maybe without having a full, obviously, road network developed for these areas in our final analysis, if we haven't, we might want to just reference, the presence of the rail. I can't remember if that's in the analysis right now, but the presence and some of those challenges with crossings. That'd be great. Other questions or comments about the draft analysis? Okay. With that, we can go back to the PowerPoint. And we'll move on. I'll hand it over to Heather to take us through our 40-year growth scenario discussion.
Thank you. Okay, so we can go to the first slide. What we have is 3 different map scenarios that include the entire area. So as you'll recall, we looked at the undesignated lands. They're not rural, they're not urban, they're undesignated surrounding the city. So that is our entire study area. And while we're not looking to include all of this area, which is somewhere between just shy of 1,600 acres, I believe. Yeah, that we're not looking to bring that all in at this point. It does make sense from a planning standpoint to think about what comes after what we're doing now and making sure that we're setting ourselves up for getting the right land uses in the right places. So we did a little brainstorming. We came up with 3 different scenarios, But these are completely up for your review and discussion, and there's only really subtle changes. So in the first scenario, as you can see, we have, oh, thank you. Mostly residential, actually fully residential in the north. We have the residential for the south area near the airway. We have commercial in the south sub-area B, I believe, is that B or A? Yeah, B. And then all of west is going to be the industrial. There's a slight difference between industrial office park and industrial manufacturing, but all of that area is designated for industrial. You'll see on all of the maps that there's going to be residential in the north all throughout. That just seemed like a logical fit with where we've been growing residentially in the past. And then where you're going to see the most variety is in the east sub area. So right now we have residential here next to our existing newer residential development. We have industrial adjacent to our industrial north side of West Union Road. And then where the changes come in is on scenario 1, we're showing a mix of business park and industrial to sort of buffer the residential and the heavier industrial uses from each other, give that sort of a transition area. And then every one of our scenarios came up with a commercial node right there down at the interchange or adjacent. So if we can just flip to the next one. So remember what this looked like.
Heather, can I real quickly, those of us online, I don't think, oh, it's starting to move. Okay, looks like the slides are moving now. We were looking at a blank slide for a second and it sounded like a lot of fun, but I couldn't see it.
Okay, so did you get a chance to see scenario 1? Glenn?
Can someone online, can you see scenario 1?
Now we're seeing it. Yeah, we're
Yeah,
seeing the
we see
view
it
that
now.
has the current slide and the next slide now.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. So let's go to scenario 2 and we'll just show the differences. And like I said, they're quite subtle. Really, the west and the north stay the same between scenarios 1 and 2, as does the south. So we're really looking in the east here. And instead of having that buffer zone where we divide residential and like an office industrial type use, we're now leaving this entirely residential. So this allows us to accommodate a little more residential land. And then we're going ahead and we're doing our mix of uses between commercial and industrial and buffering this commercial site down here. So that's the difference. The main difference between 1 and 2 is just this area here. And then in the third scenario, we do a little change up here in the west. We kind of flip our office industrial with our manufacturing industrial. So instead of doing these smaller parcels, I think, you know, also to Glenn's point, there could be some joint ownership here. It might make a great opportunity for manufacturing. We didn't want to exclude that. But north stays the same, south stays the same. And then here we just really capitalize on the industrial business park and industrial manufacturer warehouse. So we really just say that we're going to limit commercial to just this portion of the east. We still have it here in the south, but we're going to say that this is all going to be some sort of industrial use at different intensities. So those are the 3 different scenarios that we were able to come up with when looking at what made sense based on how the city's developed in the past and where those transportation connections are and those sorts of things. But we definitely want to get some feedback on this. So I don't know how, it would be great if we could display all 3, but I'm not sure we can.
Well, and to be clear, Heather, we don't have to choose one of these
Oh, right,
scenarios,
thank you.
right? These are just examples, yeah, to get the ideas flowing. So I think it's okay for us to use any one of these, Heather, to use to talk from.
Yeah.
And again, our idea here is let's get an idea of what we think the land uses should be going forward. And then at our next meeting, we'll actually say, okay, here are the acreages in these different areas where we want to have this urban growth boundary expansion. We'll already have some land uses in place. And we'll just be looking at how many acreages we want to take in each direction.
Could you go back to scenario 2? Is there a particular reason that we have to follow a property line in that scenario?
No,
So that's what you've done. You follow the property line. So this could move one way or the
absolutely.
other. Yeah.
Yep, it's flexible.
Could you take property and split some residential and industrial also.
Yes, and that was sort of the intent of what we did here, to say it's not necessarily going to be like, you know, half and half or anything like that. We don't know how it would ultimately draw polygons there, but we wanted to show that it would be some sort of mix of those two uses. Those are great questions. Maybe just to start it off, we just talk about the north and south, since they stay the same in what we as staff came up with. Are there thoughts on going pretty much fully residential? Now, remember, residential does include parks. It includes possibly some small neighborhood commercial type uses, but primarily residential and different density. You know, so it could be that it's got a higher density towards the city and lower density further out, or, you know, if there's a community park here, but residential here. Any thoughts on that?
Not necessarily, I don't even know if I'm on, by the way. Okay. Not necessarily any thoughts, except for what you're doing is that you're gonna overload Glencoe coming into the city with that much residential up on top. And although you could take, and I apologize, I can't remember the name of the street. I can see it there, but barely with my glasses. But that doesn't allow you also Highway 26 direct access. Gordon, thank you.
Oh, that's right.
Thanks. So long-term, that would be a question in regard to what I asked earlier. And that is that could Gordon Road interchange ever occur, or is there any kind of NODOT situation that we have to study on a 40-year basis? So.
Oh, and I believe that what Glenn heard was, would Dersham be an interchange? Which
That's
it
what I
is.
asked.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then looking at this, just looking at the amount of residential going up north, providing two access points into that northern area because of the quantity of people that would be up there.
So we do have in our current TSP also, we do talk about the possibility of something happening with Gordon. So there's something there right now.
Aspirational project.
But you know, something, bringing some of that industrial stuff that's already out there on that side, out on something like that would be a lifesaver.
I agree. It's never, it would be a lost opportunity if we didn't ask Glenn at every meeting. And we get interchange access at Gordon Road.
Well, I think that ODOT has already said that it's within the 1 mile. We've heard that over and over and over.
Yeah.
And so the thing is, have we ever talked about moving Gordon farther to the west?
I was just gonna say that.
So.
Although then you get pretty close to Dersham.
Yeah, as I was gonna say, I think if you moved it west, you get too close to Dersham.
They're equally spaced. Yeah. Dersham.
I think we did it, before we go to Kevin, I think we did at our last meeting, Glenn, just talk a little bit about whether it might be possible to have some sort of more limited access to Highway 26 via Gordon. I don't know what that would look like, but not a full interchange.
Haven't seen anything, but I would say that my experience in working with the engineers is that off ramps are easier than on ramps.
Kevin?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Just a clarifying question. It seems like we're getting into urban reserves here. Is that kind of the goal here, is to start thinking about establishing urban reserves for North Plains? Or is this exercise for a different purpose?
Yes, I guess we had not thought of this as an exercise in establishing urban reserves. I could see how you might think that. It was more to, rather than at one meeting trying to decide what direction are we going to grow and what are the land uses going to be, we decided to decide for our whole study area, what do we think the land uses would be at this meeting? And then our next meeting will decide, okay, now that we know what we think we want the long-term land uses to be, which acreages do we want to bring in to the urban growth boundary for this expansion? Hadn't really thought about the idea of urban reserves. I assume that would be a challenging endeavor, but I see what you're thinking there.
Yeah, and I'm actually not here to say you can't think about urban reserves. I mean, it is something that you can consider. I just wanted to understand, because there's a process for that, and I haven't really thought through. But now that you've clarified that, Steve, thank you. That's helpful.
And that also reminds me, Kevin and Steve, that even if we say that this north area makes sense to be residential, there's nothing saying we bring in the whole area with this project, right? So if we have serious traffic concerns and we say, well, we know we want some residential there, but we are worried about the traffic, so we're just gonna bring in a portion now, and then when we look at it again in 15 years, then we'll decide if there's other traffic considerations or options there. So that's another thing to think is, it's not the whole entire area that needs to be considered. And again,
Sure.
it's not even-
No, I think going back to your question, it makes sense for that to be more residential than industrial or commercial. Yeah, it makes sense.
That's what
But I
we
can't see, I think I'm with Charlie as far as, boy, if that were to come in, that would definitely put a considerable amount of strain on Glencoe
Right.
and possibly even
interchanges.
commercial, and Gordon, sure, even Beach. I mean,
Yeah,
people are gonna look for a way out,
Yeah.
it could be really problematic.
Glenn's got his hand raised.
Thanks. First, commend you for really looking at what it takes to make a complete city as you grow. A lot of Oregon cities, don't have that foresight, and they say, "Oh, we need more houses. We need more houses, more houses." And this is, much better community building to have places people can live and work in their community and can take shorter trips. All those great things, and for the health of the city's finances, which I think you probably owe a thanks to Bill, because he's very sharp on that. So a positive note and then a note of concern. I don't know what you're looking at for the commercial, quote unquote, for the area in South B, what kind of uses that is. And I don't know what the function is at the south side of Glencoe interchange there. It may be just fine. It's 38 acres. I don't know what the performance is off the top of my head. I know that as you'd go into UGB concept planning, that ODOT would want to be looking at some numbers there. There is an interchange area management plan. It would have to be updated. It says so in the IAM that if there's a comp plan change, that would have to be updated. There's a big difference between retail and office and other things like that. So I'd just be curious to know as you move forward what you're thinking of there. And again, I don't have enough knowledge to make a judgment call on is it a good idea or a bad idea. It's simply 40 acres and it's next to interchange that always raises ODOT's concerns. The other thing, just so you know, ODOT has the access controlled just beyond a little bit farther south even than South B. So there would not be any driveway access or new public access likely onto Glencoe Road. So it'll all be accessed from local streets.
Glenn, thanks, Glenn. Just to kind of get at the south side of the freeway there, potential commercial use. With all of the growth in Cornelius and Forest Grove, Glencoe from the south is actually now a very busy commuter interchange on Highway 26. So the likelihood would be some kind of true commercial retail services there to take advantage of trips that are already there would certainly be new trips created probably to visit any retail and commercial there. But there's already a lot of commuter traffic off and on headed south to Cornelius and Forest Grove. So it makes sense to look at it that way. So that would have to factor into all that is what we'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you, Glenn, for bringing up the south sub areas, because we'll just go there next and hear if any of the other PAC members here have thoughts on south sub area A being designated for residential, which is parcelized into residential lots currently, or south sub area B, as Bill stated, being a commercial use. Any thoughts there? Any objections to?
I just have concerns about serviceability as far as water, sewer, and getting underneath that highway. And how viable is that?
And I think one of the other concerns of the commercial is there would have to be a signal light at each. How that, as far as proximity to the interchange.
So
I know ODOT doesn't like it, but they do it.
Yeah, you'd have to have and you'd have to have some kind of more defined multi-lane turning as well.
So there would be infrastructure and transportation impacts of that, but is there another zoning designation that wouldn't have those concerns for you as far as just what we're showing for a potential zoning? Is it driving with what you, I hear your concerns about developing it, but as far as zoning it this way in the future, or now, is this what you would think of for the development type?
I would think any type of a zone over there would have all those impacts.
Right.
And
Okay, great. Let's look at the west area, which just had that one minor change. So we really thought that with the Dersham Road connection, this could be a strong industrial manufacturing, primarily, and then some industrial business park, whether it's here or it's here. And I think on that last scenario where we put it here, we thought, well, that is a good neighbor option to the residential. So there's that consideration. But having it in this consideration gives it, yeah, thank you, Andy. So we had pros and cons when we went back and forth of whether we would want to see more business park here or put the business park with closer access to Dersham. Any thoughts on that? Or so the first question is, does industrial make sense also to the rest of you on this, knowing how much, what our EOA said as far as what we're going to need for that type of use? Is this a reasonable place to put that type of use?
I see like in Hillsborough, Beaverton, the manufacturing and the office and stuff kind of gets mixed.
Yes, yeah.
Throughout the whole area.
Yeah.
I don't know if we would entertain that also, that this would just be a mixture.
Yeah, and we did talk about that too, about how right now we have an M1 and M2, like a lower intensity industrial and a higher intensity industrial, and that maybe that's not the way things go in the future, that maybe we do look at a different type of industrial, that it's kind of an industrial office type zoning. But that's a great point. Thank you. Yeah, so not a strong feeling of exactly where that happens in that area, but that industrial office type mix could make sense on the west side.
Well, I think you have to look at the example of Helvetia interchange, and that the business park is at the intersection,
Oh, okay.
at the interchange, because that's where you have your closest traffic flow and stuff,
That's a good
and
point.
the high visibility.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thanks, Andy, right?
Both of these comments get back to what Stuart said earlier about, we set this up by parcel lines, but
Right, but it can
that
be.
isn't necessarily the way that it's gonna go.
Yep, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about the east sub area. We all, four of us who talked about this agreed that this made sense. Andy, follow. This made sense to be industrial because it's just kind of finishes that edge north of West Union. It's already developed industrial on the north side of West Union. Yeah, okay, getting a lot of head nodding, that we'll just leave that one there. Next, on all of the scenarios where we have the gap between Sunset Ridge and the existing city limits, we were thinking residential there to sort of fill in the rest of that neighborhood complete. We have the opportunity to enlarge the park that's in Sunset Ridge. We have the opportunity to enlarge that commercial node. We sort of laid it out for those, which would be a neighborhood commercial node, so it would support the residential uses. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So then the commercial, this is down near, this goes to Stuart's point, when you want visibility for your commercial, more based business that gets traffic coming to it, needs some visibility. We thought that made sense. And again, it's a pretty small area based on the parcel line. So we might decide that needs to be a little bit bigger and go beyond that parcel line. Does that make sense? Zoning wise? Yeah.
Again, if depending on how you want your city to grow, you may want to put that side in a business park and then allow your commercial to develop in your downtown or your other area. Because what I continue to see is if we're peeling people off, which would likely maybe service from that north side.
Yeah.
If they're going to peel off Jackson School and you put your commercial, you're not going to be taking people close to downtown. And so depending on how the city wishes to develop that downtown corridor, I would probably look at that as a business park, alternate use as well.
So leaving
Yeah.
that in the purple, but then maybe pulling some red into the extension of commercial.
Something that, again, complements what's going on with the city and city's growth.
It's a great
I
thought.
think that if we want to attract any type of sizable commercial, it's gonna be out there on the highway. It's gonna be accessibility for people going to Hillsborough, Forest Grove, Cornelius, going to the beach. Plus the residents of North Plains also. But if you stick it, you know, in the interior, you're only gonna be trying to service just the people of North Plains. You're not gonna get that other, which would be hard to attract, I think,
Yeah.
larger commercial buildings.
And forgive me, Bill, for not knowing this off the top of my head, but does the EOA address commercial as far as like if we are aiming towards some larger footprint uses versus like some small retail, like we divide that out?
Big lots. Yes, the EOA does identify, I believe, 10 to 20 acres, I think, of larger, what we would call larger retail, but most of the site need for commercial retail identified is moderate and smaller, actually. I mean, but yeah, if you put commercial near a freeway interchange, hotels, restaurants, you know, that you know what the profile is traveling yourselves, so you can predict what would happen.
One of the other things we talked about too is that now we're kind of getting to where commercial and certain industrial uses like business parks, they start blending into each other. And you may not want to have a hard line commercial versus industrial.
So if we
May
can
have-
switch back to
if the
scenario
resident-
two.
More of a employment mixed use.
So it might be more like this hashed commercial industrial
Right.
business park type thing that goes all the way to the corner. And the other point I was gonna make as far as, you know, wanting to grab more traffic off the highway is if we really do end up choosing to go commercial here, we might capture what the EOA lists as our need for that type of development.
If I could ask Kevin a question. Kevin, when we ultimately submit an urban growth boundary UGB expansion request, is it acres by residential, industrial, commercial? What is that? What does it exactly look like, and how fine grained do we need to get with the uses? Is it just we want to meet this residential need and we have enough acres to do it, or we need to show more than that?
Yeah, good question, Steve, and it's a nuanced answer. You know, because there are some differences in terms of how you plan for residential versus employment lands, and I use the term employment lands to commercial industrial. You know, I'll kind of basically mash together the you know, the types of land use needs identified in EOAs. Because of that, there is some need to say, and you know, there is not a requirement to fully plan UGB expansion areas, but in an area where you're saying large lots are a priority and that's why we're choosing it, you need to base that on an industrial land need, right? That's not the case for residential lands. And so you might be thinking about that as you look at different candidate areas. You know, we've talked about the South sub area, and that sub area B, I guess that area might lend itself well to smaller commercial or residential versus a large lot industrial park, you know, for obvious reasons, you know, along those lines. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I was getting to is if we simplified this to, you know, we're getting into nuance here. If we simplified this to employment and residential, it might be a lot clearer and yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to determine that you know, as part of the UGB expansion decision. It's sufficient to say these are employment lands. We'll figure out the master planning or the zoning, the comp plan designation for those areas later. You know, as long as you just kind of provide a general sense of that. Now, Glenn is going to say he's concerned about what specifically happens at the time of comp plan designation and zoning, especially as it relates to, you know, interchanges. And so that's what you need to think about, but that may be down the road. It kind of depends on how much you want to plan this out at this phase.
That's really helpful, Kevin. Thank you. Just looking at this scenario too, I think the one last piece, because I think that's a great idea, is to keep those as employment and then have it be employment and residential. And on this map, the difference does show some residential south of Sunset Ridge adjacent to Recology here. So on the other maps, Andy, if you want to just click through, you'll notice that that's industrial or some sort of industrial residential mix on the other two. So what are thoughts on that? And really what this gets down to is if we're meeting a certain amount of residential land need, then if you're going to put some of it here, you're going to do less of it somewhere else, right? So it's a balance. Do you want to have really focused residential, maybe not all at this time, but eventually have your residential really focusing up here? And of course, we're considering this is residential, and then this gap here, or do you want to? Oh, I'm
As
sorry.
you're talking.
Sorry. Do you want to have all of your residential in the north sub-area or and south sub-area A, as well as the northwest corner of sub-area east?
General direction.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Or do you want to consider the middle of south of the east sub-area for either a residential employment mix or just straight residential?
I personally would like to see where you got the jagged area on the east side over there,
Mhm.
kind of pull that down. So you tuck that school a little bit more inside the residential
yeah.
area. And then I think a lot of that area, myself, my personal opinion, would be nice to keep industrial. And
So kind of
and
buffer
commercial.
the
A little more
residential that's
about
there.
Residential, yeah.
And then it's-
And then the residential you already have drawn in there, I think it's great. And it gives you that connection across the creek and everything too.
Okay.
In that area.
General.
Second that.
Yeah.
Well, my opinion is that I don't think we want to load north with residential until we really figure out what we're going to do about traffic. We already know there's traffic issues. There's going to be more traffic issues as it develops. So I would like to see options open for more residential lands in other areas. I think the east is a great candidate for a large residential area because it's proximity to transportation and we're already established there. There might even be some residential node to the east area along Mountaindale Road, Gordon
To the west.
area. Excuse me, in the west area to connect to the north area. As another opportunity, I think, for us to keep continuing talking about the south as residential. I think we're just wasting our time. It's already overdeveloped. We're not gonna, nobody's gonna change it. So let's not even consider that.
We have to.
I wish we.
I don't care.
I know, I get it, I get that. Other thoughts on expanding residential further into the west sub-area?
I really like kind of the drawing number 2 personally. It offers for residential over there on the east side. And I don't really like any of the industrial to the east. I think it should be all on the west side, basically. And truck traffic and all that kind of stuff, keeping it down at the interchange down there, not going, trying to go through town with trucks and all that kind of stuff. So, and then as far as the residential, just looking into the future, I'm thinking that higher resident or high density would be closer to the commercial business park stuff and maybe a lower density is towards the West Union side. Use that as thinking in terms of the use of the property. So, and obviously there's already an industrial place there, but it's buffered by wetlands. And so
Right.
there's the buffer actually to keep it away from everything anyway. So
Yeah. So that was, that would take basically the purple out of the east area, except for north of West Union, I would think.
well, it's already there, right? So we can't
Right, right.
make them get out of there, but.
So having this be more of a residential with some commercial in the east sub area, and then really focusing. Now, I think if I'm remembering back to when we originally started looking at this exercise, we couldn't accommodate what the EOA called for industrial in the west alone. So we did need some more acreage to do that.
That's possible. I'd have to have those numbers up in front of me, but that's possible that the west sub area is not sufficient. I'll look while you continue that.
So the wetlands that's in the, on the east side right there, the industrial and the residential,
Yeah,
the wetlands part of it doesn't eat into our numbers as far as what we need for.
right. We're able to
development,
take out constrained lands and it is considered constrained.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so as far as gross acreage, technically speaking, the west has more than the it has roughly, it's pretty close to the 545 acres that we know we need for industrial land anyway. The issue really for the city regarding where industrial goes is that on the east side, we can less expensively and much more quickly put infrastructure in to serve employment uses faster. Extending infrastructure to the west and putting all of our employment land over there would guarantee a longer, more expensive lift to get businesses here. So from a kind of a city feasibility standpoint, some sort of balance between the both would be helpful. Because the sooner we can extend infrastructure to get employers here, the quicker that helps the business, employment, tax base, that sort of thing. So that's a consideration too.
Well, you have to consider who's paying for the infrastructure. Isn't development paying for the infrastructure? The city's not gonna do it.
Depends on the type of development.
I'm just gonna jump in. We're at 7:15. We do want to provide an opportunity for public comment, but I don't want to cut this conversation short. But I will say if the PAC, if it's okay with the PAC members, that what we'd like to do at our next meeting is essentially a similar exercise, but this time with the actual urban growth boundary. Rather than kind of a wide open conversation starting from scratch, we'll come with a few ideas that we can use to kickstart our conversation based on what we've heard from you all today. So before we move to public comment, are there any other PAC comments from PAC members or? I know there were a couple in the chat, Andy, we could put those in the record as well.
Do you want me to?
I just want to make sure that we have enough buffer around, I think on the east side, for sure, from the school and the existing residential.
So Jessica asked, what about your new roundabout to help mitigate traffic? We have no new roundabout yet, but we are efforting that with the county incentive program.
That's a really good point, though.
That is a great point, Jessica Pels from Washington County. And then Chris Edmonds, he's not a PAC member, but he's.
That can kick off our public comment period.
Okay, great.
So it says the regional mobility benefits for lands in the east make it very attractive to high value employers, particularly in the Silicon Forest supply chain. Thank you, Chris. Any folks in our audience today who want to come up and share some public comments at this time? Please. Or does the one up there work, Andy?
It should. Yeah, give it a tap later. It should work.
Thank you for having me. I'm Bill McCandless, president of Roth Development over at the Sunset Airport. I wanted to reiterate that I'd like to be excluded, particularly the South 8 area, which is already built out with many residences. There's some area which Bob Josie addressed, which is not residential yet. So there are some constraints. We have to think about the airport residential overlay that allows people to have hangars, houses, and so on. But there's also a thing called an airport safety overlay. You can imagine coming off either end of the runway, slopes at 3 degrees, which is sort of fan shape. That makes me worried about development in South Area B for any vertical components. We have to be careful we won't make the contingents. So again, I'd like to reiterate, we prefer the exclusion of both A and B. I heard a mention over here of PAC somebody from the state who wanted to re-include these exception areas.
I don't think I said it. If I did, I didn't mean to.
Okay, I was gonna ask for contact info, because our attorneys prepared a report for 3J consultants and so on, but I'd like to forward to the state if need be. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to make public comments at this time, sir, please?
Hi, I'm Stu Peterson, a commercial real estate broker, 42 years, and a partner in McCown Forbes. Recently relocated to Lake Oswego for downtown Portland for 40 years. But I've been following this, and I think the plan is pretty well laid out the way it is right now. I mean, east side industrial is immediately developable, and there was a conversation about who's going to pay for it. There's enough mass there in acreage that the developers will, in exchange for system development credits, traffic impact fees, whatever, bring the services to you if it's economically feasible, which I don't know that it is, but looking at it, where your utilities are, I think it could be. That's a very liquid area. Being on the freeway like that, when I say liquid, I mean it's high demand. Industrial lands are probably our most constrained, perhaps residential, our guys are arguing on that, but there's a real need for it. The west side of the city for industrial land is going to be a lot more problematic because of the traffic through town. You're going to be competing with the land that's coming in on the west side of Hillsborough that has really good freeway access. And I think it'll take some time for that to realize its moment, I guess I'd say. And the other thing, one other thing I want to comment about, I heard about the semiconductor, the $52 billion. I've heard about that. It comes with a lot of strings on what you can do, and it narrows and makes the zones very myopic, and your land can sit around a long time waiting for a needle in a haystack to show up to realize a revenue. So I'd be very cautious about getting involved with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else here tonight that would like to make public comment? Anyone else online that wants to make public comment?
Not seeing any hands raised at this time.
Okay, then let's go to the next steps and we'll wrap up for the evening.
Yeah, Patrick, I can do that. And then this slideshow is also available on the that's the wrong one. There we go. northplains.org website. We have an urban growth foundation page there, but that up. And then Bill or Steve,
yeah,
we'll get you the next steps.
So as I mentioned, what we'll do is our team will work with Andy and Bill to come up with some UGB expansion scenarios based on what we heard tonight. And this group will meet again, probably in early October, I would say, if not late September. Based on that conversation and the recommendations made by this PAC, we will kind of formalize that. We'll put that together, and this group will meet one more time to give it a stamp of approval. And then we'll move forward, hopefully around the end of the year, into the adoption process with Planning Commission and City Council. And then beyond that, with Washington County and the state, which I'm sure will extend into 2023, probably into the spring of 2023, I would anticipate. Any questions about our process going forward? Well, thank you to everyone who's here in person, everyone who participated online. This was a great conversation. We have a lot of information to move forward with. And we look forward, I know everyone's been waiting for this, the actual expansion conversation, and we can tell you that that's coming up at the next meeting. So look forward to meeting with you again soon. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.